In the marble courtyards of Topkapi Palace, as the muezzin's call faded across the Golden Horn and the last silver of daylight withdrew from the Bosphorus, the harem quarters settled into a silence more layered than the shadows between the arched columns. Here, behind latticed windows and through corridors scented with amber and jasmine, the most guarded secrets of the Ottoman Empire unfolded in whispers soft as silk against skin. I am your DrowZy historian, companion to the night, here to guide you through these forbidden chambers where power wore veils and where women who would never be named in official chronicles shaped the fate of an empire that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of the Caucasus. Rest now among the cushioned alcoves and let the echoes of that distant world carry you gently to sleep. The palace wrapped itself in night like a jeweled cloak, and as the last administrative business concluded in the outer courtyards, the heart of imperial life truly began to pulse in those inner sanctuaries where no man save the Sultan himself could venture. The imperial court of women, as it was formerly known, was far more than a collection of beautiful companions. It was a university of influence, a labyrinth of loyalties, and a stage upon which the most consequential dramas of empire played out in shadows. Tonight we drift through those marble halls as they might have appeared in the 16th century, when the court reached its most refined complexity under Suleiman the Magnificent. Picture corridors lined with Iznik tiles that caught and held the warm glow of oil lamps, their blue and turquoise patterns seeming to flow like water in the flickering light. Underfoot, carpets from Persia and Anatolia muffled the sound of slippered feet, while overhead, gilded ceilings reflected the gentle radiance of hanging brass lanterns. Topkapi itself did not reveal all of this at once. The palace had been built in layers after Mehmed the Conqueror took Constantinople in 1453, and its plan was less like a single grand house than a small walled city placed at the point where the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara seemed to gather their breath. Courtyard opened into courtyard. Gate followed gate. The farther one walked from the public threshold, the more silence and permission mattered. The harem was not originally the large, tiled world later visitors would imagine. It grew with the dynasty, room by room, passage by passage, as imperial family life moved closer to the center of government. By Suleiman's age, and more fully in the generations after him, the private household and the machinery of rule had become so near to one another that a whispered decision behind a screen could touch a battlefield months away. The word harem came from a root meaning sacred, forbidden, protected. It did not simply mean pleasure, and the old European habit of making it a place of lazy fantasy tells us more about European desire than Ottoman reality. In Topkapi it meant the guarded household of the ruler, where mothers, daughters, consorts, servants, teachers, eunuchs, children, and retired women lived in a system of rank as exacting as anything in the Divan Council. A door could mean rank, a cushion could mean rank, the right to sit near a brazier, to receive a tray first, to have a lamp kept burning late, to send a letter through a trusted hand, to walk in a certain garden at a certain hour. All of these were small permissions that formed the language of power. At dusk that language became easier to hear. The outer palace still carried the memory of scribes, petitioners, guards, grooms, cooks, pages, and ambassadors, but the inner quarters listened to another clock. A silver ewer might be lifted from a shelf. A servant might fold a towel twice instead of 3 times because the woman who used it had fallen slightly from favor. A young musician might hear that the Sultan preferred a plaintive makam that week and rehearse until her fingertips ached. Behind the lattice, the empire did not sleep. It turned inward, slowed its step, and spoke in gestures small enough to be missed by anyone who believed history only happened in public rooms. This is why the evening corridors matter. Their beauty was not decoration alone. The Iznik tiles with cobalt stems and curling tulips held a visual grammar of order and abundance. Lamps were placed so that polished surfaces glowed but did not glare. Water moved somewhere nearby, cooling the stone and masking the smallest private sounds. The lattices gave women air and filtered views while preserving the separation on which Ottoman household honor depended. A girl newly arrived from the Caucasus or the Balkans might pass beneath those lamps with fear in her chest, smelling rose water and wool and wax, and not yet know whether the palace was ending her life or beginning another one. Both could be true, and in Topkapi, both were often true at the same time. The Valide Sultan's apartments occupied the highest pinnacle of this feminine hierarchy, chambers befitting the mother of the reigning sultan, a woman whose word could elevate a concubine to imperial favor or condemn a rival to lifelong obscurity in the palace's forgotten wings. Her evening routine was a careful choreography of ritual and purpose. As the light faded, she would receive the whispered reports of her network, news from the kitchens about which girl had caught the sultan's eye, intelligence from the bath houses about emerging alliances, updates from the pedagogy quarters about which young women showed promise in music, poetry, or the subtle arts of conversation. In her private study, illuminated by beeswax candles that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with books bound in Morocco leather, the Valide Sultan would compose the careful letters that maintained her influence across the empire. Her correspondence reached the mothers of pashas, the wives of governors, the abbesses of convents where fallen favorites sometimes found sanctuary. Each letter was a thread in a web that extended far beyond the harem walls, connecting her to sources of information and levers of power that formal court channels could never provide. The Valide Sultan did not rule by accident. She was often the only person in the palace who had known the reigning sultan as a child, had seen his temper before it became policy, had heard his fears before courtiers learned to praise them as wisdom. She understood which memories softened him, which insults he never forgot, which advisers made him restless, which kinds of music steadied him, which news should be delivered in the morning and which should wait until after the evening meal. In a court where access was power, maternal access was a private road to the center of the state. The rooms around her were arranged to protect that road. Eunuchs guarded thresholds, but the real protection was social. A petition might arrive disguised as a request for charity. A provincial family might send an embroidered cloth not only as a gift, but as a reminder of loyalty. A mosque foundation might need support. A daughter married into a pasha's household might ask her mother to intercede in a quarrel that could otherwise become a faction. The Valide's desk gathered these threads with the soft patience of a loom. The scratch of her reed pen was quiet, but a sentence written there might determine the future of a governorship in Egypt, a supply contract in Aleppo, or the marriage prospects of a princess whose dowry would move land, money, and alliances. In the age of Suleiman, the figure who changed the balance of this household most dramatically was Harem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana. Her rise from captive concubine to legal wife of the Sultan unsettled older expectations, and because she was witty, politically alert, and unusually close to Suleiman, her presence altered the harem's sense of what a woman could become. Harem wrote letters full of affection and practical concern. She built charitable complexes. She watched the dangerous question of succession with a mother's intensity. Around her, people learned that the harem was not merely a place where sons were born. It was a place where futures were organized. After Harem came other women whose names still carry the faint shine of lamplight on tile. Nurbanu, Safiye, Kosum, Turhan. Each lived in a different political weather. Nurbanu, mother of Murad Roman III, maintained links with Venice and the Eastern Mediterranean. Safiye, favorite of Murad Roman III and mother of maimed Roman III, received foreign envoys through carefully managed channels, and was known in European reports as a woman of formidable influence. Kosum would later become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. a mother and grandmother of sultans, moving through regencies, palace crises, and the terrible fragility of dynastic survival. Turhan, in the 17th century, would help steady a court shaken by instability and support the completion of the Great Yenikami near the harbour. These names should not make the harem feel less intimate, they make it more so. Each of these women still passed through doorways at night, each heard fountains, each knew the weight of fabric in summer heat, the ache of waiting for news, the danger of a servant who repeated the wrong phrase, the comfort of one trusted companion who understood without needing to be told. Their power did not lift them out of domestic life. It passed through domestic life, through mothers' rooms and baths and nurseries and letters sealed with wax, until the private and imperial became nearly impossible to separate. But the most delicate negotiations happened here, within the harem itself, in conversations that took place during the evening ablutions that preceded the night prayers. The hammam or bath house served as neutral territory where women of different ranks could speak with relative freedom. The ritual washing became a time for counsel, for the sharing of intelligence, for the forging of alliances that might last for decades or dissolve with the morning light. The newest arrivals to the harem, girls often little more than children, would gather in the communal bath under the watchful eyes of older women who served as both mentors and guards. These young newcomers, captured in raids or presented as gifts from provincial governors, had been torn from families they would likely never see again. Yet for all the tragedy inherent in their circumstances, many would find in the harem's structured environment the only path to power available to women in their age. The cleverest among them learned quickly that survival depended not on beauty alone, but on the careful cultivation of useful skills and the even more careful navigation of competing loyalties. The bathing ritual itself was an exercise in hierarchy and intimacy combined. Junior women poured the water, intermediate ranks prepared the oils and perfumes, while the most senior courtesans offered advice in voices barely above whispers. Steam rose from the marble basins like incense, and in that warm, humid air, plans were laid and secrets shared that would ripple through the empire's politics for generations. The hammam softened the outlines of rank without erasing them. A woman might leave her brocaded outer garments on a carved chest and enter the steam wrapped in plain cloth, her jewels removed, her hair loosened, her face made damp by heat. Yet even here rank spoke, who entered first, who sat nearest the warmest marble, whose towel had been warmed, whose soap carried the faint, expensive trace of musk from Yemen or ambergris brought by sea traders. The newest girls learned to notice these things because mistakes in the bath were remembered elsewhere. A careless laugh, a glance held too long, a refusal to move aside quickly enough, all could become material for later judgment. For the frightened newcomer, the bath could be the first place where the palace stopped feeling entirely unreal. The water was physical and honest, steam gathered in the throat, copper bowls rang softly against stone. An older woman might show her how to rinse rose-scented soap from her hair, and for a moment the touch could be almost maternal. Many arrivals had been renamed by the time they reached Topkapi, their earlier languages already slipping into the past. In the bath were Albanian, Georgian, Greek, Circassian, Slavic, Turkish, Arabic and Persian words mingled under the dome. A girl might hear a word from home and turn her head before she could stop herself. That small turn told observant women almost everything: loneliness, origin, usefulness, vulnerability. Training began in these small exposures. Not formal lessons yet, but correction, how to lower the eyes without seeming dull, how to answer a senior woman with warmth but not familiarity, how to accept praise without appearing hungry for it, how to remember who had helped you and who had only pretended to help. The harem's first curriculum was attention. A young woman who could not read a room would never read a court. The bath, with its steam and echoing ceiling, made every voice sound softened, but it did not make every voice safe. The older women understood that advice was a kind of investment. A girl with quick intelligence might one day become a favorite or a teacher or a trusted attendant to an imperial child. Helping her early could create gratitude that lasted for years. Yet too much help could make rivals suspicious, so counsel often arrived indirectly. A senior woman might speak of another girl long dead who prospered because she kept her grief private until she had allies. She might describe the way Hafsa Sultan, Sulayman's mother, managed a household with discipline and generosity. She might mention that Harem had not risen by beauty alone, but by wit, patience, and the ability to make herself necessary. The lesson floated in the steam without ever being named. Evening ablutions also created a neutral ground for conflict repair. Women who could not visit one another openly might exchange a phrase near the basin. A servant who had carried a rumor could retract it without a public apology. A rival might offer a cake of scented soap not as affection, but as a signal that a quarrel should not grow larger. These small rituals mattered because open conflict inside the harem was dangerous for everyone. The palace prized order. Disorder invited intervention, and intervention could expose secrets that several factions preferred to keep hidden. When the bath quieted, the marble retained warmth. Droplets clung to the walls. The women emerged with hair damp beneath fine cloth, carrying the fragrance of clean skin, heated stone, and oils pressed from flowers. Their steps toward prayer were slower, not because the politics had ceased, but because the body had been reminded that it was tired. In a place where ambition could stretch across decades, the rhythm of washing and prayer made time bearable, one evening at a time. As the women completed their ablutions and moved to the prayer hall for the evening devotions, their collective voice rose in Arabic verses that had echoed through the palace for centuries. Yet even in this moment of supposed spiritual unity, the careful observer would notice the subtle arrangements: who stood where, who caught whose eye, which woman received the honor of leading the prayers. These details spoke of a complex social order where every gesture carried meaning, and every position represented the outcome of countless small competitions for favor and influence. The prayer hall drew the community into a single pattern, and for a few minutes the palace breathed as one body. The words were ancient, the movements familiar, the floor cool beneath knees and palms, yet the harem's social map remained visible in the spaces between shoulders. A woman recently honored might find herself nearer the front than before. A teacher whose pupil had pleased the Valide might be greeted more warmly. A girl who had angered a senior attendant might stand slightly apart, close enough to be included, far enough to feel the lesson. In Topkapi, exclusion did not always require a locked door. Sometimes it was the width of one cushion. Religious life inside the harem was not merely ceremonial. Women commissioned Qurans, endowed fountains, supported soup kitchens, sent money to Mecca and Medina, and built charitable works that carried their names into the city. Harem's great complex near the Suleymaniye, with its mosque, schools, hospital, and kitchen, spoke in stone of a woman whose piety and politics could not be cleanly separated. Later, royal women would endow mosques near harbors and market streets, placing mercy where crowds would see it. Charity was devotion, but it was also memory. A woman whose life had unfolded behind screens could still make the city repeat her name through bread, water, prayer, and architecture. The harem's teachers knew this well. When they instructed young women in recitation, they were also teaching posture, breath, memory, and self-command. To memorize sacred verses required a steadiness that served many other arts. A woman who could hold a long passage in her mind could also hold a chain of favors, a genealogy of rival families, a poem by Fusuli, a list of gifts sent by a governor's wife in Bursa, or the exact wording of a promise made beside a fountain 2 winters earlier. Memory was worship, and memory was politics. After prayers, the silence did not break all at once. It loosened gradually. Someone adjusted a bracelet, someone asked for a shawl, a servant gathered lamps, a senior woman might pause at the threshold, letting two younger women pass before her as a public kindness or holding them back with a glance if they had forgotten themselves. The night opened into smaller rooms again, each with its work, its pleasures, its hidden calculations. The palace had prayed together, and now it returned to the 1,000 private tasks through which a dynasty sustained itself. After prayers, the harem dispersed into its evening occupations, each group pursuing activities that served both personal development and political positioning. In the music quarters, young women practiced on instruments whose melodies would drift through the latticed windows into the sultan's private gardens. The oud, the ney, and the canon created harmonies that were as much about demonstrating refinement as they were about personal expression. A girl who could play with exceptional skill might find herself summoned to perform for the sultan himself, an opportunity that could transform her entire future within the palace hierarchy. Music in the harem belonged to a larger Ottoman art of mood. A makam was not only a scale, it carried color, time of day, temperament, the memory of longing or repose. The ney could sound like breath passing through a reed at the edge of sleep. The oud held the warmth of polished wood against the body. The canon, with its many strings, shimmered like lamplight broken across water. A gifted teacher could hear from the first measures whether a student merely had nimble fingers or whether she had learned restraint, the harder art. In palace music, silence was part of the phrase. A note held too long could feel pleading. A pause placed well could feel like wisdom. The sultan's private gardens lay near enough for sound to travel, especially on evenings when the air over the Bosphorus was still. Music could reach ears that words could not. It might soften a mood before a petition was presented, honor a festival night, comfort a prince who had been frightened by news from a provincial posting, or mark the return of a campaign season. Women who performed well became associated with certain emotional weather. One might be remembered for a song that calmed Selim after a day of harsh reports. Another might be requested whenever Murad desired poetry sung in Persian. Such associations could lift a woman into visibility more safely than obvious ambition. Meanwhile, in the embroidery chambers, needlework served as both meditation and currency. The most exquisite pieces were presented as gifts to wives of foreign ambassadors or to the mothers of important military commanders. A woman's reputation for needlework could earn her a workshop of her own, complete with apprentices, creating a source of both income and influence that extended her reach throughout the empire's administrative apparatus. Embroidery trained another kind of patience. Threads of silk and gold passed through stretched cloth again and again, slowly making tulips, carnations, cypress trees, clouds, vines, and stars. The hand had to be steady even when the mind was troubled. A poorly tied knot might not show at first, but it could loosen months later in the hands of a woman far away, and with it loosen the reputation of the maker. Palace needlework therefore taught responsibility to unseen futures. Every stitch said, in a language without sound, that the maker understood endurance. The gifts carried messages that polite conversation could not. A cloth heavy with pomegranates could suggest fertility, abundance, or a hope for many sons. Cypress trees could speak of eternity and morning. A tulip might refer to beauty, cultivated taste, or the pleasures of Istanbul in spring. Iznik ceramics, textiles, and manuscript margins all shared this language of flowers, and women used it with care. When a wife of a governor in Edirne received a cover worked in a pattern associated with the palace, she knew she had not been forgotten. When an ambassador's household received an object of exceptional delicacy, the gift said that the harem, though hidden, had noticed the world beyond its screens. The embroidery room also offered a cover for speech. Women could sit for hours with heads bent, hands occupied, voices low. A conversation about thread color might turn to the character of a new eunuch. A discussion of gold braid might become a careful inquiry into whether a certain pasha still enjoyed favor. The cloth in the lap created an innocence around the gathering. Anyone entering saw only industry, discipline, and feminine refinement. The women themselves understood that the needle could be a veil for intelligence as useful as any lattice. The library, a room that few outside visitors to the palace would expect to find in the harem, buzzed with quiet activity as older women instructed younger ones in the arts of reading and writing. Literacy was a form of power, enabling private correspondence and the careful maintenance of personal records that documented favors given, debts incurred, and alliances formed. Some of the harem women became skilled poets themselves, their verses circulating through manuscript copies that found their way to literary salons across the Ottoman world. The library smelled different from the bath and music rooms. It held the dry sweetness of paper, leather, dust, gum arabic, and ink. Manuscripts rested on low stands. Reed pens were trimmed with small knives. Sand was kept nearby to dry wet script. A novice first learned how not to ruin a page, how to sit, how to breathe away from the line, how to dip the pen without blotting, how to keep her sleeve from dragging across fresh ink. Then came letters, verses, phrases, accounts, formulas of greeting and blessing. The discipline looked quiet, but it opened doors that beauty alone could never hold open. A literate woman could read what others tried to hide from her. She could compare the tone of one letter with another. She could preserve a promise in her own hand instead of trusting a servant's memory. She could write to a daughter married into the household of Rustam Pasha, to a son sent as a prince-governor to Manisa, to a physician, a jurist, a merchant's wife in Galata, a foundation steward near Hagia Sophia. Literacy allowed a woman to stretch herself across distance. In a palace designed to limit movement, the written line became a corridor of its own. Books in the harem need not have been only devotional. Poetry, histories, dream manuals, medical works, moral advice, literature, dictionaries, accounts of earlier dynasties, and collections of letters all had practical uses. A woman who knew history could recognize a recurring danger. A woman who knew poetry could console, flatter, or wound with elegance. A woman who knew medicine could treat fevers and childbirth complications before male physicians were permitted near. A woman who kept accounts could see whether a steward was honest. Knowledge was never abstract in Topkapi. It always returned to a body, a household, a favor, a risk. In one of the library's quieter alcoves, a story is told of a concubine named Safiye who spent her evenings copying medical texts in Arabic and Persian. She had convinced the palace physicians to teach her their techniques in exchange for rare herbs that her family in the Balkans managed to smuggle into Constantinople through networks of Greek merchants. Over time, Safiye's knowledge of healing made her indispensable not only to the women of the harem, but to the Sultan's own children. When rival factions later sought to diminish her influence, they found that too many people owed their health to her careful ministrations. Whether this Safiye belonged to record or palace legend matters less than the kind of truth the story preserves. In the harem, usefulness could become protection. A woman who soothed a child's cough, prepared a salve for cracked hands in winter, recognized the signs of a dangerous fever, or knew which herbs calmed the stomach after rich food, possessed a form of authority that did not depend on rank alone. The body is democratic in its needs. A valide sultan and a kitchen girl could both be humbled by pain, and the woman who relieved that pain gathered obligations from every level of the household. Medicine also carried danger, because healing and poisoning lived near one another in the suspicious imagination of courts. A cup of sherbet, a syrup of violets, a poultice, a sleeping draught, a powder stirred into honey, all could be read as kindness or threat depending on who offered them and who was watching. For this reason, the harem's healers needed reputations as careful as their remedies. They had to show their ingredients, name their sources, accept supervision, and keep records. A remedy that worked once could create gratitude. A remedy that failed at the wrong moment could destroy a life. Education in Topkapi did not make the harem gentle in any simple way. It made it more capable. The young women studied language, manners, religion, music, sewing, household management, and the arts of pleasing speech because the palace required competent people. Some would become intimate companions. Some would be married out to statesmen carrying palace manners into elite households. Some would teach the next generation. Some would remain servants whose competence held the daily world together. The training could be severe, but it acknowledged that women were not ornaments. They were instruments of continuity. The night deepened, and in the pavilions that overlooked the palace gardens, the most senior women held their own informal courts. These were spaces where the rhythm of palace life slowed to accommodate conversation that ranged across decades of palace memory. Here, a woman who had served 4 different sultans might share insights about the patterns that connected seemingly unrelated events, how a particular military campaign had actually been influenced by a quarrel between 2 concubines, or how the empire's policy toward Venice had shifted because a Venetian merchant's daughter had gained the ear of the Valide Sultan. The garden pavilions gave these conversations air. Beyond the screens lay cypress and plane trees, beds of flowers, narrow paths, the black shine of water in basins, and sometimes the far lamps of ships moving along the Bosphorus. In summer, the scent of jasmine could grow almost heavy. In winter, braziers were carried in, and women wrapped themselves in furs or quilted robes while the wind pressed against shutters. The pavilion was neither entirely indoors nor entirely outside, and that made it a fitting place for memories that hovered between private experience and public history. Senior women often understood the empire through households rather than maps. They knew which governor's wife had a proud temper, which admiral's mother was devout, which pasha had married above his confidence, which family in Bursa had been insulted by a seating arrangement 10 years earlier and still remembered it. Official dispatches reported taxes, troop movements, rebellions, and appointments. The harem's memory reported temperament. Empires survive on grain and soldiers, but they are disturbed by pride, grief, jealousy, shame, affection, and fear. The women in the pavilions had spent their lives studying those forces at close range. One might speak of Nurbanu Sultan and her Venetian connections, how a woman rumored to have origins in the Venetian world could become a bridge and a suspicion at once. Another might recall Safiye Sultan's dealings with foreign envoys, the careful way gifts were weighed, delayed, accepted, or refused. Someone else might mention Kosum, still in the future for Suleiman's 16th century court but already foreshadowed by the logic of the palace. If a child came to the throne young, if factions circled, if janissaries pressed, the mother who controlled access to the child might become the hinge on which the state turned. In this way, older women spoke not only of what had happened, but of what could happen again. These conversations were not always solemn. There was humor in them too, because long confinement sharpens the eye for absurdity. A pompous official could be reduced to a story about the way he spilled sherbet on his sleeve. A famous beauty could be remembered for snoring. A dreadful quarrel could, after 20 years, become a tale told with laughter because everyone survived it. Such humor mattered. It kept the palace human. It allowed women to hold hard memories without being crushed beneath them. The evening meal in the harem was itself a complex ritual. The most junior women ate simply, sharing bread, olives, and cheese in communal halls where conversation was carefully modulated to avoid giving offense. But in the private dining chambers of the senior ranks, elaborate feasts unfolded that rivaled anything served in the men's quarters. These meals were opportunities for hosting, for cementing alliances, and for demonstrating the prosperity and sophistication that befitted women, whose children might someday rule the empire. The preparation of these private feasts required its own hierarchy of kitchen slaves and cooks, creating yet another network through which information flowed. The woman who chose the evening's menu held a form of soft power, able to honor guests through the selection of their favorite dishes, or to send subtle messages through the inclusion or omission of particular delicacies. A pomegranate served out of season might signal that the hostess possessed valuable connections among the palace merchants. A dish prepared in the style of a particular region could indicate political sympathies or nostalgic loyalties. Topkapi's kitchens were famous, and even in the harem their reach could be felt in the rhythm of trays, bowls, copper lids, charcoal, bread, fruit, sherbets, pilafs, stews, sweets, and preserves. Food passed through so many hands that every tray became a small report. If a senior woman ate little, the kitchen knew. If she requested sour cherries twice in 1 week, someone noticed. If a young favorite suddenly received richer dishes, that news traveled faster than the steam from the rice. The kitchen did not merely feed the palace, it listened to appetite, and appetite often betrayed the hidden weather of power. The menu could carry memory across geography. A dish from Edirne might comfort a woman who had passed through that old Ottoman capital before coming to Istanbul. A sweet from Bursa might honor a guest whose family held property there. Fish from the Bosphorus, rice from Egypt, spices from the Red Sea trade, sugar, almonds, dried apricots, olives, lemons, and honey all reminded the diners that the empire entered the harem by taste. Even women who rarely crossed the palace thresholds consumed the world in small portions, one spoonful at a time. Dining together required choreography. Servants presented basins for washing hands. Cloths were spread, cushions were arranged according to rank. Conversation began lightly and moved only where the hostess allowed it to move. A clumsy guest might speak of politics too soon. A more skilled one might begin with a poem, praise a dish, ask after a child, mention a charitable foundation, then finally touch the matter she had come to advance. The meal trained patience. It taught that a request made before the rice could fail, while the same request made after coffee might succeed. The pomegranate out of season was especially eloquent. To obtain it required storage, trade, favor, or money. Its red seeds shone like small jewels, each one held within a pale chamber, a fruit built like a palace of hidden rooms. Served at the right moment, it could say abundance, it could say fertility, it could say, I have reached beyond these walls. It could also remind a guest that the hostess had sources she did not need to name. As the meal concluded and coffee was served in delicate porcelain cups, the conversation turned to the news that had arrived that day from beyond the palace walls. Letters from sons who had been appointed to governorships, reports from daughters who had married into influential families, intelligence about the movements of rival court factions, all this was discussed in low voices, while servants refreshed the braziers that kept the rooms warm against the coolness that crept in from the Bosphorus. Coffee itself had entered Ottoman life with its own aura of wakefulness, conversation, and unease. By the later 16th century, coffee houses in Istanbul could worry authorities because men gathered there to talk, joke, recite poetry, and complain. Inside the harem, coffee had a different but related power. The tiny cups encouraged lingering. The bitterness sharpened attention after a rich meal. The grounds left at the bottom could invite playful fortune-telling, though pious women might smile and dismiss such things. A servant refilling cups learned who wanted to remain alert and who wished to withdraw. News beyond the palace was never simple. A victory on the frontier might mean celebration for the court and mourning for a woman whose brother or son had died far away. A new appointment could delight one faction and alarm another. A marriage proposal might appear honorable while quietly removing a troublesome young woman from the center of influence. Reports from Galata and Pera, from merchants, interpreters, dragomans, sailors, and embassy households, entered the harem in fragments, and the women assembled those fragments with the patience of mosaic workers, setting small colored stones into a larger pattern. Foreign observers often misunderstood this hidden discussion because they could not see it. Venetian bailey, Habsburg envoys, French merchants and travelers wrote about the Ottoman court from the outside, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with fear, often with fantasy. They knew that women like Nurbanu and Safiye mattered, but they could not always explain how. They saw gifts sent, petitions answered, appointments shifting, audiences delayed, and they sensed invisible hands. The harem for them became a locked box into which they poured rumor. For the women inside, it was not rumor, it was work. In the palace workshops, craftswomen continued their labors by lamplight, creating goods that would find their way to markets across the empire. The harem operated its own textile production, jewelry workshops, and perfume distilleries. These enterprises generated revenue that gave the senior women a degree of economic independence, but more importantly, they created trade relationships that extended the harem's intelligence network across continents. A bolt of specially woven silk might carry hidden messages sewn into its patterns. A jar of rare perfume could serve as payment for information gathered in a distant market. The workshops had their own night music, scissors closing, thread pulled through cloth, pestles grinding aromatic resins, metal tools touching silver, glass bottles clicking softly against one another, a scale pan settling under the weight of amber or cloves. Perfume made the invisible tangible. Rose water from carefully tended petals, sandalwood, musk, lavender, citrus, peel, myrtle, and storax could be blended into scents associated with rank, mourning, celebration, or seduction. A woman's fragrance might precede her into a room and remain after she had gone, a delicate announcement of presence in a world where presence was often controlled. Economic independence inside the harem did not mean modern freedom, but it mattered. A woman with income from estates, workshops, stipends, gifts, or foundations could reward loyalty. She could pay scribes, support a dependent, endow a fountain, send charity to a holy city, or commission repairs to a mosque roof. Money created movement. It allowed intentions to travel where bodies could not. For this reason, the accounting of the harem was as important as its poetry. Ledger books, seals, receipts, and steward reports formed another quiet archive of female power. The workshops also trained women for lives beyond Topkapi. Many palace women were eventually married to officials, and they entered those households with refined skills, connections, and expectations. A woman who had supervised embroidery apprentices in the harem could supervise servants in a pasha's mansion. A woman who understood perfume supply could manage luxury purchases. A woman who knew how gifts moved between households could become a political actor in her own right. The harem was enclosed, but it was not inert. It exported discipline, manners, and networks into the ruling class. Sometimes the most important object leaving the workshop looked harmless. A sash, a pouch, a quilted cover, a Quran case, a child's robe. In the folds could be a note, or in the pattern a signal, or in the timing of delivery a message more precise than words. If a gift arrived before a religious festival, it meant one thing. If it arrived after a military setback, another. If it came through a merchant family known to favor Venice, or through a household linked to Egypt, or through a woman whose aunt lived in Pera, the route itself became part of the meaning. The most intriguing of the evening activities took place in chambers that no official record acknowledged existed. Here, in rooms accessed through passages known only to the most trusted servants, the harem's intelligence operations unfolded. Women who had been trained in the arts of code and cipher worked by candlelight to decode messages that arrived through channels that bypassed the empire's official diplomatic apparatus. Letters were concealed in the false bottoms of jewelry boxes, in the binding of apparently innocent books, or in the lining of garments that traveled with merchant caravans. It is tempting to imagine these secret rooms as theatrical, filled with dramatic shadows and dangerous maps. The truth may have been quieter. Intelligence often looked like ordinary competence. A woman compared two versions of the same rumor. Another remembered that a certain merchant had once lied about the price of silk and therefore might lie again. A third noticed that a letter used a greeting common in one region but claimed to come from another. Someone else knew that a phrase of blessing had been altered by one word, perhaps by mistake, perhaps as a warning. Such work did not require a dagger on the table. It required memory, patience, and suspicion disciplined by experience. Ottoman statecraft already had official channels of information. Governors, judges, scribes, military commanders, tax officials, palace servants, and spies. The harem's channels did not replace these. They supplemented them with forms of knowledge men often ignored. Women's households knew marriages, pregnancies, illnesses, resentments, dowries, debts, domestic humiliations, and family ambitions. A rebellion might be prepared by men in public, but the emotional conditions that made it possible could be visible first to women in private rooms. The harem gathered that softer intelligence, not because it was sentimental, but because it was useful. Eunuchs were crucial intermediaries. The black eunuchs who guarded the harem and the white eunuchs connected to other palace services occupied difficult, powerful positions. They crossed thresholds others could not cross. They heard requests, carried objects, enforced rules, protected secrets, and sometimes became political actors of consequence. The chief black eunuch, especially in later centuries, could control access to the harem and to the valide sultan, linking the private household with imperial pious foundations and the holy cities. In the nightly life of Topkapi, a trusted eunuch's footstep in a corridor could mean a message had arrived that could not wait until morning. Codes did not need to be mathematically elaborate to be effective. A flower could stand for a person, a color could mark urgency, a missing decorative element could signal danger, a poem copied with one altered word could direct attention to a name, a letter that seemed to discuss whether in Bursa might actually report the mood of a governor's household. The safest code was often one that looked like ordinary feminine correspondence to anyone who thought women were incapable of strategy. Prejudice itself became a screen behind which intelligence could move. One such woman, according to palace legend, had developed a code based on traditional embroidery patterns. A particular arrangement of flowers and geometric shapes could convey detailed military intelligence or the political leanings of a provincial governor. Her needlework was prized throughout the empire for its beauty, but only a few initiated individuals understood that each piece carried information that influenced the empire's strategic decisions. When she finally died at an advanced age, her apprentices found that her last embroidery sampler contained a complete genealogy of the empire's secret intelligence network, worked into a pattern that appeared to be nothing more than decorative flowers. The sampler is a perfect palace object because it can be read on several levels. To a child, it might be beautiful. To an apprentice, it might be a lesson in stitch, symmetry, and discipline. To a rival, it might be a harmless relic of an old woman's vanity. To an initiated reader, it might be a map of loyalty. Carnation for one household, tulip for another, cypress for a dead patron, cloud band for a route across Anatolia, blue thread for the sea road, gold knot for a payment received, red seed for danger. The object did not shout, it waited for the right eyes. Such stories remind us that women's material culture often preserved what official archives did not value. A ledger may record the appointment of a governor, a chronicle may praise a sultan, but a textile, a recipe, a lullaby, a childbirth charm, a marginal note in a book, or a pattern taught from one hand to another may preserve the emotional and social infrastructure that made the official event possible. Topkapi's deepest history is therefore partly tactile. It lives in the imagined feel of silk thread, polished wood, cold marble, paper softened by use, and the little raised edge of dried ink under the fingertip. The night advanced toward its deepest hours, and the rhythm of the harem shifted into its most contemplative phase. In private chambers throughout the complex, women engaged in activities that served both personal fulfillment and political preparation. Some crafted letters that would be carried by trusted messengers to friends and allies in distant cities. Others studied maps and histories, maintaining their understanding of the empire's complexities, so that they could offer informed counsel when opportunities arose. Private letter writing was one of the knight's most delicate labors. A letter had to sound like the woman who sent it, but it also had to survive the eyes of anyone who intercepted it. Too much warmth could be dangerous, too little could offend. A request had to be wrapped in courtesy, framed as concern, softened by blessings, and sometimes hidden under a discussion of health, weather, children, or gifts. The opening formula mattered. The closing mattered. The choice of messenger mattered most of all. A beautiful letter carried by an unreliable hand was only a confession traveling toward an enemy. Some women wrote to sons far from the palace, and these letters were heavy with tenderness and strategy. Ottoman princes traditionally learned governance in provincial courts, where their mothers and households accompanied them and built local networks. The practice changed over time, but the memory of the prince's provincial household remained central to dynastic politics. A mother advising her son had to teach patience without making him weak, ambition without making him reckless, obedience without making him irrelevant. She might remind him to honor judges, reward soldiers fairly, listen to old servants, avoid needless cruelty, and remember that a single careless favorite could ruin a reputation years in the making. Others wrote to daughters married into elite households. These daughters were bridges, and bridges carry weight from both sides. A princess or palace-trained woman in a pasha's house could report mood, debt, illness, loyalty, or resentment. She might ask for help with a cruel husband, a jealous mother-in-law, a steward stealing from her dowry lands, or a child whose fever would not break. Through such letters, the harem extended itself into mansions along the Bosphorus, into houses near the Blue Mosque, into old neighborhoods around Hagia Sophia, into Edirne, Bursa, and beyond. Maps and histories offered another kind of comfort. To study the empire at night was to place personal fear inside a wider pattern. The Ottomans had risen from a frontier principality near Bursa. They had crossed into the Balkans, taken Edirne, conquered Constantinople, pressed toward Vienna, held Arab lands, holy cities, islands, ports, mountain roads, and river valleys. A woman in Topkapi might never see most of these places, yet the taxes, soldiers, brides, captives, luxuries, rebellions, and news from them shaped her daily life. The empire was vast, but in the harem it arrived as a tray, a rumor, a letter, a face, a fabric, a song. The courtyards that had bustled with discreet activity earlier in the evening now settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by the distant sound of fountains and the soft rustle of night breezes through the cypress trees. Guards moved silently along the covered walkways, their presence providing security without intruding upon the privacy that was so precious in this world of constant observation. Privacy in Topkapi was never simple. The harem was hidden from the outside, but inside it people watched one another constantly. A woman might be protected from the eyes of foreign men and still exposed to the scrutiny of servants, rivals, mentors, eunuchs, children, and friends. The architecture created layers of concealment rather than solitude. Screens hid one view and opened another. A corridor allowed movement but also announced it through footfall. A courtyard offered air but placed everyone in relation to windows above. To be alone required rank, trust, or luck. The fountains helped. Their murmur softened speech and gave restless minds a sound to rest upon. Water in Islamic palace architecture carried practical coolness, spiritual association, and aesthetic pleasure all at once. It marked refinement and paradise imagery, but it also masked the ordinary noises of bodies living close together. A whispered confession beside running water could remain between two people. A woman crying quietly in the night could be spared the humiliation of being heard too clearly. The same fountain that delighted the eye protected the heart. In one of the upper pavilions, an elderly concubine who had long since passed her years of potential imperial favor sat by an open window, writing in a journal that she had maintained for over 5 decades. Her entries chronicled not the great events of state that would fill the official histories, but the small moments of human kindness, the daily compromises, and the tender friendships that had made life bearable within the palace's golden cage. Her writings captured the sound of children's laughter echoing from the nursery quarters, the sight of young women helping each other with elaborate hair arrangements, the satisfaction of a particularly successful feast, the quiet pride of watching a former student rise to positions of influence. The old woman's journal, if we imagine its pages, would not be tidy in the way official history is tidy. It might record that a storm over the Bosphorus frightened the younger girls and made the lamps tremble. It might remember the exact blue of a tile repaired after a servant dropped a tray. It might note that one woman sang beautifully after receiving news of her mother's death, because singing was the only way she could keep from collapsing. It might preserve a recipe for quince paste beside a rumor of war. It might describe how a child who once hid behind cushions later became a prince whose signature changed the fate of men he would never meet. Journals like this are rare because the lives of women in seclusion were not preserved with the same official care as decrees and campaigns. Yet historians learn to listen for them in traces: a foundation inscription, a surviving letter, a foreign envoy's complaint about a woman he could not meet but could not ignore, a list of payments to harem servants, a repaired chamber, a gift register, a note in a manuscript. The archive is full of absences, but absence is not silence. It is a challenge to hear differently. When that old woman's journal was eventually discovered years after her death, historians found in it a different portrait of harem life than the one preserved in official documents. Yes, there had been competition and intrigue, but there had also been genuine affection, scholarly pursuits, artistic achievements, and a complex social order that provided structure and meaning even within severely constrained circumstances. Her entries reminded future generations that behind all the political maneuvering and the struggles for influence were human beings who found ways to create dignity and purpose in their prescribed roles. This is the balance any honest story of the harem must keep. It was not a paradise of female rule, and it was not merely a prison of idle captives. It was a constrained world in which coercion, ambition, tenderness, education, discipline, loss, privilege, and intelligence existed together. Some women suffered terribly, some rose astonishingly. Many lived between those extremes, making friendships, learning skills, protecting children, fearing demotion, enjoying music, missing vanished homes, laughing in kitchens, praying in small rooms, and finding meaning where they could. A sleepy history should not flatten them into fantasy. It can lower the light without lowering the truth. The old woman might have understood that better than anyone. She had seen beauties forgotten, clumsy girls become indispensable, proud women humbled, quiet women endure. She had watched fashions change in sleeves, perfumes, poetry, and politics. She had learned that the palace punished impatience and rewarded those who could wait without appearing to wait. Her journal's deepest lesson may have been that power inside Topkapi was often slow. It accumulated like dust on a windowsill, almost invisible day by day, undeniable after years. As midnight approached, the harem's activities wound down toward their quietest phase. The final prayers of the day were offered in small groups, with women gathering in their private chambers rather than in the formal prayer hall. These intimate devotions created space for personal reflection, for gratitude despite hardship, for hope that the next day might bring small improvements to their circumstances or to the welfare of those they cared about. In these smaller prayers, voices no longer needed to merge with the whole community. A woman could pray for a son's safety, for release from a rival's malice, for the health of a feverish child, for patience with a difficult superior, for forgiveness of envy, for a letter from home, for the ability to accept a fate she had not chosen. The prayer rug became a small island. Around it were cushions, trays, folded garments, lamps, perhaps a book left open, perhaps a cup with a dark line of coffee at the bottom. The sacred entered the ordinary without ceremony. Some women kept private devotional objects, prayer beads worn smooth by years of touch, a small Quran copied in fine hand, a scrap of calligraphy, a charm against illness, a cloth from a holy place, a little packet of earth or scent associated with memory. These objects were not always grand enough for inventory, but they mattered because they could be held. In a world where so much depended on rank and permission, the fingers closing around beads offered a rhythm no one else controlled. The servants who remained active during these latest hours moved with special discretion, understanding that their presence should be barely perceptible. They refreshed the oil in lamps that would burn until dawn, arranged cushions and throws for women who preferred to sleep in the pavilions rather than in their formal chambers, and prepared the light refreshments that would be available to anyone who woke during the night and desired a piece of fruit or a cup of herbal tea. Servants knew the palace in a way the powerful did not. They knew which floor stone was coldest before sunrise, which latch clicked too loudly, which lamp smoked, which window admitted a draught from the water, which senior woman woke if a tray was set down carelessly, which child needed singing, which older concubine pretended not to need help standing. Their knowledge was practical, intimate, and often unrecorded. Without them, the refined life of the harem would have dissolved into discomfort within a day. Yet servants also lived within danger. To be invisible was useful until blame required a body. A missing jewel, a repeated rumor, a spoiled dish, a delayed message, a stain on silk, a child frightened by a careless word, any of these could fall upon a servant with little protection. The kindness of a powerful woman could make service bearable. Her anger could make it terrifying. The late-night rounds therefore required not only quiet feet but emotional intelligence. A servant learned when to speak, when to pretend not to see, when to remember, and when forgetting was the safest form of loyalty. In the nursery quarters, slave women watched over the children who would someday inherit the empire, singing soft lullabies in languages from across the Ottoman realm. These children grew up hearing Turkish and Arabic, but also Albanian, Georgian, Circassian, and Greek. The linguistic diversity of the harem ensured that the next generation of rulers would possess an intuitive understanding of their empire's cultural complexity. The nursery was among the tenderest and most politically charged spaces in Topkapi. A sleeping child could be adored for himself and feared for what he represented. A prince was a son, but he was also a possible future around which factions might gather. A princess was a daughter, but also a marriage alliance, a household founder, a patron, a bridge into the elite governing class. The women rocking cradles and humming lullabies were not outside politics. They were holding it in their arms. Children learned the palace before they understood it. They learned the smell of warmed milk, wool blankets, rose water, and lamp smoke. They learned which footsteps meant comfort and which meant correction. They learned that some doors opened and some did not. They learned to be handled by many hands and watched by many eyes. A prince might grow up surrounded by affection, yet also by expectation so thick it became part of the air. The lullaby soothed him, but the future waited at the edge of the cradle. For girls, the nursery and schoolrooms offered another route into power. Ottoman princesses could become significant patrons, owners of property and makers of alliances through marriage. Their weddings moved wealth and rank. Their households employed people, supported charities, and maintained connections to the imperial center. A princess taught in the harem learned not only refinement but the responsibilities of representation. Her composure at a feast, her generosity to a foundation, her loyalty to her mother, her influence over a husband, all could matter. The privilege of caring for these imperial children was both an honor and a heavy responsibility. The women chosen for nursery duty often found that their influence extended well beyond child rearing, as the princes and princesses they tended would remember their early teachers throughout their adult lives. More than one important policy decision could be traced back to a story told or a lesson imparted in the palace nurseries during those quiet midnight hours. Stories told to children carried values in softened form. A tale of a just ruler could become advice about mercy. A story of a greedy vizier could warn against flatterers. A fable about a patient bird could teach endurance without naming current danger. A memory of Bursa's green tombs, Edirne's bridges, or the old walls of Constantinople could give a child a sense that the dynasty belonged to more than the rooms he knew. The women who told these stories shaped imagination, and imagination shapes the limits of policy long before a ruler signs a decree. There is a quiet paradox here. The harem was designed to control women's movement, yet through children it reached into the future more deeply than many public institutions. A nurse's phrase could return decades later as a sultan's habit of mercy or suspicion. A teacher's warning could make a princess cautious in marriage negotiations. A lullaby in Greek or Circassian could leave a ruler with a childhood memory of the empire's many tongues. The night nursery, soft with breathing and song, was therefore not outside history. It was one of history's hidden beginnings. Beyond the nursery, in chambers reserved for the children of concubines who had not achieved the rank of imperial mother, other forms of education began early. These children, who occupied an intermediate position in the palace hierarchy, were trained in arts and skills that would prepare them for various possible futures. Some would marry into important families, others would pursue religious callings, and a few would find their way into the empire's administrative or military structures. Their midnight hours were filled with studies that encompassed everything from classical literature to practical mathematics, from diplomatic protocol to trade languages. The uncertainty of these children's futures made their education broad. A girl might need poetry to charm a household, arithmetic to understand estate income, religion to command respect, and embroidery to demonstrate refinement. A boy might need languages, history, etiquette, and loyalty to survive near power without being consumed by it. Teachers therefore prepared them for several possible lives at once. The palace wasted little. Even those who would never stand near the throne might serve the dynasty through marriage, administration, piety, or skilled household management. At night, lessons could continue in whispers because daylight was crowded with duties. A tutor might review Persian couplets while a child fought sleep. A servant might trace numbers on a slate. A young girl might practice reading a formal greeting by lamplight, stumbling over honorifics until the older woman beside her smiled and made her begin again. Such scenes were small, almost domestic, yet they formed the quiet infrastructure of an empire that depended on trained households as much as trained armies. The most secluded chambers of the harem housed women whose stories had taken unexpected turns. Former concubines who had fallen from favor but possessed too much sensitive knowledge to be simply dismissed found comfortable but limited quarters where they lived out their lives in relative obscurity. Some had committed minor infractions against palace protocol. Others had simply been displaced by younger arrivals. Still others had chosen to withdraw from the competitive atmosphere to pursue contemplative lives. These women often became the harem's institutional memory. the keepers of stories and precedents that helped guide the decisions of their more actively involved sisters. They spent their evenings in quiet activities that served the broader community, copying manuscripts, preparing herbal remedies, teaching younger women the subtle arts of palace navigation, and maintaining the networks of correspondence that connected the palace to its far-flung constituencies. Their rooms may have seemed uneventful to outsiders, but they held a deep store of precedent. An older woman could remember how a similar dispute had been handled under Selim, or which kind of gift once offended a proud household, or how a girl from a certain region had struggled until someone placed her with the right teacher. She knew which punishments hardened resentment and which reconciliations lasted. She could tell whether a new conflict was truly new or merely an old pattern wearing a fresh face. Younger women came to them quietly, not always for dramatic secrets, more often for practical advice. How should one answer a summons from a senior favorite? What does it mean if a eunuch waits but does not enter? Which scribe writes too slowly? Which steward can be trusted with money? How does one send charity without seeming to purchase praise? How does one survive being overlooked after years of hope? The answers were not found in official manuals. They lived in women who had watched the palace long enough to know the difference between danger and noise. Some of these secluded women had lost more than favor. They had lost children, patrons, languages, youth, and the imagined life they once thought would be theirs. Their usefulness did not erase grief. It gave grief a place to sit. A woman who had been disappointed by power might become wise about it, and that wisdom, offered in a low voice over herbal tea, could save a younger woman from a mistake that beauty and ambition would not have saved her from. One such woman, a former favorite of a long-dead sultan, had devoted her later years to creating the most comprehensive cookbook the palace had ever possessed. Her recipes were not merely instructions for preparing food, but detailed guides to the cultural and political significance of various dishes, the seasonal availability of ingredients across the empire, the dietary requirements of different religious communities, and the symbolic meanings that could be conveyed through careful menu planning. Her work became an essential reference for anyone planning the diplomatic feasts that were such an important part of imperial statecraft. The cookbook was really a map. It marked when lamb was tender, when fish were best from the Bosphorus, when cherries could be preserved, when rose petals should be gathered before the sun grew harsh, when spices became too costly because a caravan route had been disturbed, when fasting customs required tact, when a guest from a particular region should be honored with familiar flavors, and when novelty would seem insulting. It understood that a diplomatic meal could succeed or fail before the first political sentence was spoken. It also preserved care. Recipes are intimate records because they assume a future hand will repeat them. Add the almonds slowly. Skim the foam, do not let the syrup darken. Serve warm if the guest is grieving. Avoid too much garlic when the conversation will be close. These instructions may sound domestic, but courts are made of bodies, and bodies remember comfort. A statesman who felt honored at table might listen more generously the next day. A princess who served the correct dish to a difficult mother-in-law might soften a household tension that would otherwise reach the palace as a political problem. The old favorite's cookbook therefore belonged beside the ciphers and letters. It translated appetite into diplomacy. It made kitchens legible as instruments of rule. It reminded the harem that power does not always enter with a seal and a decree. Sometimes it arrives in a covered bowl, fragrant with cinnamon, set down at exactly the right moment. As the night reached its deepest point, when even the guards moved silently through their routes, and the fountains seemed to bubble more softly in the courtyards, the harem achieved its most peaceful state. The women had settled into sleep in chambers and pavilions throughout the complex, some alone in private rooms that reflected their high rank, others in shared quarters that fostered the friendships and alliances that made palace life tolerable. The sleeping arrangements themselves told a story of the harem's social organization. The most junior women slept in large dormitories where privacy was minimal, but the comfort of community presence helped ease the loneliness of displacement from their original homes. Intermediate ranks enjoyed smaller shared rooms where they could form the close friendships that often lasted for decades, and sometimes evolved into the political partnerships that shaped palace policy. The senior women possessed private chambers, but even these were designed with reception areas where they could entertain guests and conduct the informal meetings that were so crucial to palace governance. The night air carried the scents that defined this cloistered world: jasmine from the gardens, sandalwood from the incense that burned in small braziers, the faint aroma of the rose water that was sprinkled on bed linens, the more subtle fragrances of the oils and perfumes that had been applied during the evening preparations. These scents created an atmosphere that was both luxurious and comforting, a sensory environment that helped transform spaces of constraint into havens of refinement. Sleep inside the harem was not uniform. A girl in a dormitory might sleep lightly, startled by every movement, still learning to trust the breathing of strangers around her. Two friends might whisper after lamps were lowered, sharing one last scrap of gossip before surrendering to fatigue. A senior woman might lie awake behind curtains, thinking through tomorrow's audience, hearing the fountain and counting obligations instead of sheep. An old servant might doze sitting up, trained by decades to wake at the smallest change in sound. The palace held many kinds of darkness. There was the blue darkness near latticed windows, the amber darkness around low lamps, the red darkness of a brazier under ash, the silver darkness of moonlight on marble, the dense darkness behind closed hangings where a person could finally loosen her face. In that darkness, rank softened but did not vanish. Dreams might return a woman to a childhood village, a mountain road, a harbor, a mother's kitchen, a language no one around her spoke anymore. Then morning would come, and she would wake again in Topkapi, carrying both lives inside her. In the pre-dawn hours, when the palace was at its quietest, occasional sounds drifted through the latticed windows from the world beyond the harem walls. The cry of seagulls from the Bosphorus, the distant sound of boats mooring or departing, the calls of night fishermen working in the Golden Horn. These reminders of the larger world served as gentle links to the empire that existed beyond the palace boundaries. Those outside sounds were important because the harem could never fully seal itself from the city. Istanbul pressed close in the dark. Bakers waking before dawn, sailors testing ropes, dogs moving through alleys, watchmen calling the hour, water sellers preparing for the day, the first traffic near the markets, the faint human murmur rising from neighborhoods around Hagia Sophia, the hippodrome, the docks, Galata across the water, Pira on the hill. The women of the harem heard fragments of a city many of them rarely entered, and the fragments gave shape to longing. The Bosphorus itself was a corridor more ancient than the palace. Ships carried grain, wood, fish, soldiers, ambassadors, pilgrims, captives, silk, rumor, disease, and hope. From Topkapi's point, the water seemed to divide and connect worlds at the same time. Asia lay across one brightness, Europe across another, the Black Sea to the north, the Mediterranean beyond the straits to the south. A woman listening before dawn might not see the ships clearly, but she could hear enough to know that movement existed. Somewhere beyond the screens, people were leaving and arriving. The empire breathed in tides. Within the harem itself, the only sounds were the soft breathing of sleeping women, the gentle rustling of silk and cotton as someone turned in their sleep, the barely audible footsteps of servants making their final rounds, and the constant, soothing murmur of the fountains that provided both beautiful sound and practical cooling throughout the complex. It was during these deepest hours of the night that the harem most clearly revealed its essential character as a place of women creating meaningful lives within the constraints imposed upon them by their historical moment. The political intrigue and competition for imperial favor were real and consequential, but they coexisted with genuine scholarship, artistic achievement, spiritual devotion, and human community. The women who had been brought to this place from across the Ottoman realm had created, within its marble walls and behind its latticed windows, a world that was simultaneously a prison and a palace, a place of limitation and a center of power. To call it only a prison would miss the learning, the patronage, the authority of mothers, the artistry, the friendships, and the women who shaped policy with intelligence sharpened by constraint. To call it only a palace would miss the captivity, the hierarchy, the surveillance, the homes never seen again, the children taken into dynastic danger, the fear that a change in favor could undo years of careful life. Topkapi held both truths, and the human mind often wants one truth because two are harder to carry. The night allows both to remain, side by side, without forcing them to fight. The harem's power was also gendered in a particular Ottoman way. It did not usually announce itself as a rival to male office. It moved through motherhood, household management, patronage, charity, marriage, education, and access. This made it easier for some men to dismiss and harder for them to resist. A vizier might hold a seal, but a mother might hold the sultan's childhood. A pasha might command troops, but a princess might command loyalty through marriage ties and property. A scribe might write the decree, but a woman might have shaped the mood in which it became possible. The stories that emerged from these nighttime hours were rarely recorded in official chronicles, but they shaped the empire's destiny in ways that were both subtle and profound. A conversation between two women sharing evening tea might result in a recommendation that influenced the appointment of a provincial governor. A piece of intelligence gathered through the harem's trade networks might prevent a military disaster in a distant frontier. A friendship formed during communal bathing might evolve into a political alliance that lasted for generations. Some later writers called the 16th and 17th centuries the Sultanate of Women, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with blame. The phrase can be misleading if it suggests that women suddenly seized a state that had previously been pure and orderly. Courts had always depended on households. Mothers had always mattered. What changed was visibility, circumstance, and the vulnerability of succession. When sultans were young, secluded, unstable, absent, or dependent on palace factions, royal women could become the most continuous figures in government. Their influence was not an interruption of Ottoman politics. It was one of Ottoman politics' recurring forms. Hurrem's letters to Suleiman, Nurbanu's international connections, Safiye's courtly diplomacy, Kosam's regencies, Turhan's patronage and political endurance all show different versions of the same deeper fact. The harem was not outside the state. It was one of the state's inner chambers. The women there did not need to sit in the divan hall to affect what happened after the council rose. They could prepare the ground before a meeting, alter access afterward, reward a loyal household, starve a rival of attention, advance a marriage, block a messenger, support a foundation, or remind a ruler of a promise made in private when no official witness was present. Yet the most durable legacy may not be intrigue. It may be infrastructure. Mosques, schools, hospitals, kitchens, fountains, bridges of patronage, trained households, educated children, charitable endowments, artistic production, preserved recipes, copied books, memories carried by servants and daughters. These lasted beyond any single quarrel. Political gossip fades, stone remains. Water from a fountain continues to fall long after the woman who endowed it has become a name, in an inscription most passers-by no longer read. As dawn approached and the first calls to morning prayer began to echo across Constantinople, the harem prepared for its transformation back into the more public institution that would engage with the empire's formal business throughout the coming day. But the relationships formed, the knowledge shared, and the plans developed during these secret nighttime hours would continue to influence the course of imperial affairs in ways that observers outside the palace walls could never fully comprehend. Dawn did not arrive as a single brightness. It entered by degrees, a pale line over the water, a grey softening of the ceiling, the first visible blue in the Iznik tiles, the brass lamps turning from sources of light into objects that needed cleaning, the chill of marble before the sun warmed it, the smell of ashes in braziers, the rustle of women waking, the first tray lifted, the first order given, the first small irritation of the day. Night's privacy thinned, roles returned to their formal edges. The Valide Sultan would rise into duty, teachers would gather sleepy pupils, musicians would put away night pieces and prepare for daytime discipline, the bath would be cleaned, the prayer hall arranged, the kitchen stirred into heat, the nursery brightened, the workshops opened, the secluded rooms visited by those who needed memory. A letter written at midnight might leave after breakfast. A gift chosen over coffee might be wrapped by noon. A warning heard in the bath might alter a conversation before sunset. The night did not disappear. It entered the day disguised as decisions. Outside, Istanbul widened into sound. The call to prayer moved from minaret to minaret, touching Hagia Sophia neighborhood mosques, the great complexes of sultans and royal women, the waterfront, the markets, the roads toward Edirne, the ferries crossing toward Asia. The palace answered by waking within its walls. Topkapi's gates, courtyards, kitchens, council rooms, barracks, stables, and private chambers all resumed their separate labors, but the harem carried the night's invisible harvest. A repaired alliance, a softened anger, a remembered illness, a coded pattern, a child's dream, a promise made beside water. The morning light that filtered through the latticed windows would illuminate chambers where the Ottoman Empire's most private business had been conducted, where its most sensitive secrets had been discussed, and where its most consequential relationships had been forged. The women who began to stir with the dawn carried within them the knowledge and experiences that had accumulated during these precious hours of relative freedom, and they would use that knowledge to navigate another day of the complex dance between power and constraint that defined their lives. By daylight, the harem could seem quieter, more orderly, more legible to those allowed only brief and controlled contact with its edges. But beneath the order lay the night world we have followed. Steam and whispered advice, prayer lines and careful glances, music used as access, embroidery used as memory, books used as corridors, meals used as diplomacy, workshops used as networks, nurseries used as futures, old women used as archives, fountains used as cover for grief and speech. The palace did not need to proclaim these things. It only needed to continue. If you were to stand in the restored harem rooms today among the blue tiles and mother-of-pearl cupboards, the gilded inscriptions and carved doors, the rooms might seem empty at first. Tourists pass through in daylight, cameras click, guides speak of sultans, mothers, favorites, eunuchs, fires, repairs, and dynastic change, yet the emptiness is not empty, it is full of vanished routines. The mind can supply the lamp smoke, the sandalwood, the silk rustle, the copper bowl, the whispered correction, the child half awake, the old woman writing, the fountain steady through every rain. Topkapi's harem asks for a slower kind of attention. It asks us to see power where modern eyes might expect only confinement, and confinement where romantic eyes might expect only luxury. It asks us to notice that women who were denied many freedoms still made choices within the narrow spaces available to them, and that those choices mattered. They mattered to children, to servants, to rivals, to charitable recipients, to artists, to cities, to governors, to ambassadors, and sometimes to the empire itself. The restored rooms also remind us that preservation changes what survives. Tiles remain more easily than voices. Marble survives better than perfume. A painted inscription can outlast the hand that dusted it every morning. The visitor sees mother-of-pearl doors, carved cupboards, gilded ceilings, fireplaces, fountains, and narrow passages, but the social meanings that once animated them have to be rebuilt with care. A threshold that now seems picturesque may once have decided who could speak. A window that now frames a pleasing view may once have been the nearest thing a woman had to the city. A small chamber may have held boredom for one person, terror for another, safety for a third, and influence for a fourth. Even the famous beauty of the harem can mislead if it is allowed to become too smooth. The tiles were repaired after fires. Rooms were altered for changing sultans, changing mothers, changing tastes, changing fears. The palace was not frozen in a golden 16th century. It aged, cracked, burned, adapted, and remembered unevenly. Suleiman's world was not Murad's world, and Murad's was not Ibrahim's, and Ibrahim's was not the world Kosum and Turhan had to navigate. The harem changed as the empire changed, from confident expansion to factional strain, from frontier energy to palace politics more anxious and enclosed. Yet across those changes, certain rhythms persisted. Washing, praying, teaching, waiting, writing, eating, listening, remembering, waking. Those rhythms are why the story belongs at night. Night reveals continuity without demanding spectacle. It lets the famous names soften back into human scale. Harem is not only the woman who altered dynastic marriage, she is also someone waiting for news from Suleiman, someone choosing words in a letter, someone hearing footsteps in a corridor. Nurbanu is not only a political mother, she is someone managing suspicion and memory. Safiye is not only an influential favorite, she is someone balancing gifts, envoys, and household loyalties. Kosum is not only a regent whose life ended in palace violence, she is someone who must once have sat in lamplight, young, learning the same lessons of attention that every newcomer learned. Turhan is not only a patron of monumental architecture, she is someone who understood that a building could speak after a woman's voice was gone. The unnamed women matter just as much. The girl who learned the canon and never became a favorite, the laundress who knew which sheets belonged to which room, the teacher who corrected a princess's handwriting, the old attendant who remembered the birth order of children no one else spoke of, the cook who adjusted spices for a grieving guest, the eunuch who carried a message and chose silence afterward, the scribe who copied a line exactly because one changed word could become a quarrel, the woman who woke before dawn and, for a few breaths, did not yet remember where she was. Their lives do not stand in the center of chronicles, but they form the human texture without which the great names become hollow. So the final secret of the Topkapi Harem is not a single scandal hidden behind a door. It is the quieter fact that an empire's private rooms were full of labor, emotional labor, intellectual labor, bodily labor, artistic labor, devotional labor, political labor, the labor of endurance and the labor of making a constrained life livable. Much of it was expected, much of it was exploited, much of it was never thanked, and still it shaped people who shaped the state. The fountain in the courtyard does not distinguish between a royal mother and a homesick servant when it reflects the morning light. It holds both images briefly, then lets them tremble together. Let this image of those quiet pre-dawn moments linger in your mind as you drift toward sleep. The sight of marble corridors touched by the first rays of sunrise, the sound of fountains that had played throughout the centuries, the sense of ancient wisdom and enduring human resilience that filled every corner of those forbidden chambers. In that peaceful transition from night to day, the harem revealed its deepest secrets, not of political intrigue or romantic drama, but of the remarkable capacity of human beings to create meaning, beauty, and community, even in the most circumscribed circumstances. Rest now carried by the echoes of those distant voices, by the memory of incense and jasmine, by the image of women who found ways to shape an empire from within its most secluded chambers. Let the gentle rhythm of those centuries-old fountains carry you into dreams where you might glimpse the shadows of a world that existed beyond the reach of official histories, where the most important stories were written not in chronicles of war and diplomacy, but in the quiet moments of human connection that unfolded each night in the forbidden quarters of Topkapi Palace.